Okay, so at this point, we're going to move to a general discussion of warfare in the Iliad. So we've talked a bit about book one. We haven't yet gotten to the actual warfare as such, but in the next section we will. And as you approach the depiction of warfare, it's good to have these general ideas of what's going on in terms of the Homeric depiction of warfare in mind. So start with the structure of the armies. So the two sides are led by a king or a prince, and they have various troops that each have their own king or prince, and these are, as I said, they're large armies divided into war bands, and each war band comes from a particular city or region. An example is the Myrmidons led by Achilles. So it's a particular war band of coming from the region that Achilles is from. And the Trojans also have a band of various allies. They speak 1,000 different tongues, it's said in book 2. And so we have these two alliances of various war bands, and there's a commander-in-chief on each side. So on the Greek side, it's Agamemnon, so he's the kind of king among kings. And on the Trojan side, it should be Priam, who's the king of Troy, but he's too old to be a commander-in-chief on the field. So it de facto is Hector. So here's a map. I won't point out everything here, but here's a map showing you where some of the key leaders come from on each side. So we see on the right side, this is a map of what's present day Turkey, and this is Greece. And remember, Troy is or was up here, and Troy, just like the Trojan side, consists of, well, Trojan forces, but also these allied forces. And one notable unit is these Lycians. Glaucus and Sarpedon are two famous warriors from there. And again, I won't go through all of the Greeks on the other side, but we mentioned Nestor comes from this region of Pylos. There's Sparta in here, and this is obviously where Menelaus comes from, this region of Laconia. So we have a large armies on each side coming from basically all of that region of surrounding the Aegean Sea. The battlefield itself takes place on this plain between the Greek camp. And if this is kind of a zoom in of the map that we just saw, Troy's here, the Greek camp here. Notice, I'll just note that the present coastline, because of buildup of sediment, is up here actually. And it takes place between these. And these two rivers come into play actually later on. So the armor used in the warfare that's described here. So the armor of Agamemnon, for instance, is one set of armor that's described in quite a bit of detail. I won't refer, but I'll refer you to the citation there, book 11, line 17 to 52, if you want to check this out. We won't go read it right now, but but based on that description, we can see that it's armor that's composed of two plates, shoulder guards, and kind of these bands or belts, right? See how it's not just one solid piece, it's these kind of bands sewn together, or belts sewn together. And this is very similar to a late Bronze Age Mycenaean armor specimens that we actually have here in the Museum of Thebes. It's called the Thebes specimens. And so we have a sense of this reflecting, let's say, actual Mycenaean age armor. Sometimes there are a few depictions where, because remember, the Homer's writing slightly after the Mycenaean age. There's you know, a few hundred years intervening. So there's some references that of maybe tactics or materiality that was probably not around at that time. But for the most part, what he's describing is reflects kind of the armor that you would have seen in Mycenaean warfare. So most of in terms of their gear, the warriors are equipped with a set of 2 spears, which are often thrown, and the Greeks in particular are described as well greaves. So the greaves are those usually metal that protect their shin, their lower legs. The helmets of various designs are described, so quite a variety of helmets. So they're sometimes made of bronze. There's sometimes boar's tusks that I think we saw that in the previous. Yeah, see this helmet is boar's tusks. See all those white little ribs there. And the chariots. So the leaders are driven to battlefield in chariots, and the rest of the troops walk. And then the other thing to note is the chariots really are used just as a mode of transport to get to the battlefield. They're not, at least as depicted by Homer, there were in the Mycenaean age, there were some examples of chariot warfare, but for the most, well, solely in Homer, they're basically a mode of transport. There's no kind of coordinated battles of chariots. So the shields, the shield will in particular, the shields will be very important when we get to book 18. We'll have a very long description of a divinely crafted shield for newly crafted for Achilles. But there are other types of shields described. Mostly they're circular, as is the one that's described in book 18. But some of them are these kind of full-length body shields that are that you see on the right. And Ajax's shield may have been like that. It's sometimes described as a rampart. And then on at least one occasion, Hector was bearing this type of body shield because in the description, his ankles and his neck both clash the dark hide of the rim. So that could only happen if we have a longer shield. That's in book 6. Archers, I mentioned archers quickly in this, the introduction to the course around war and literature themes. So I mentioned how archers generally get a bad rap, especially in Homer. So they're often, as I mentioned, decried because they're not having to bravely stand up to hand-to-hand combat, so to speak, or to close combat fighting. But there are some archers in the Iliad, despite this, as I said, bit of a reticence to valorizing them. There's the Locrian contingent, who are all archers, and they also fight with slings. And the narrator says they also had no love for stand and fight encounters. Again, this aversion to close combat fighting. But other than the Locrians, the archers operate individually. So it's not as though they have a coordinated attack, that they all volley arrows at the enemy as a way of kind of a strategic long-range attack. No, they're operating individually after individual targets. So in the Battle of Agincourt, which we'll talk about when we get to Henry V, the English victory was largely enabled by this kind of larger group effort of archery, as opposed to this kind of individual picking of targets. As I mentioned, they're referred to as cowardly, and I mentioned this Diomedes, who, after being wounded by Paris, replies, "So brave with your bow and arrows, big bravado, glistening lovelocks, roving eye for girls. Come try me in combat, weapons hand to hand. Bow and spattering shafts will never help you then. You scratch my foot and you're vaunting all the same, but who cares? A woman or an idiot boy could wound me so. The shaft of a good-for-nothing coward's got no point, but mine's got heft and edge. So quite the powerful distinction there for Diomedes between his sword for close combat and Paris's weapon. So too, Idomeneus, the Cretan captain, brags to Meriones, second in command of the Cretans, while the latter is back from the front in search of a new spear. So he says, spears, if it's spears you want, you'll find not one but 20, all propped up on my shelter's shining outer wall. Trojan weapons, stripped from the men I kill. It's not my way, I'd say, to fight at a distance, out of enemy range. So I take my plunder, spears, bossed shields, helmets, and breastplates, gleaming, polished bright. So the thing to note there too is the kind of these prizes that one gets from battle. So one prize we saw was a concubine. That might, it would be if you sack a city, that type of thing, maybe bring back as a war prize, a concubine. But other prize would be after vanquishing a hero. You in these Homeric epics, it's the victorious warrior strips them of their armor and takes that as a type of war prize. Now, what makes it, I guess, an honorable war prize is that they were able to take them. They were able to take them because they were that close. They were that fighting hand to hand, so to speak, as opposed to the archer is not going to be able to do that. And this is a distinction that Idomeneus really highlights here. And Hector, again, another kind of similar point here, urges his fellow Trojans to storm the Greek walls in Book 15. No more standing back, no fighting these Argives at a distance, kill them hand to hand. So that's kind of on the one side, this, as I said, this denigration of those who fight with missile weapons, notably archers. But the insults against archers are usually lobbied, well, almost always lobbied against the enemy. Archers that are helpful to the army on one's own side are praised. So Aeneas praises Pandarus' archery skills and urges him to attack Diomedes with his bow in Book 5. We see Agamemnon praising Teucer for his archery and promising him a great gift when they finally sack Troy. And Idomeneus praises Teucer. So Idomeneus, the same person I just mentioned who had that speech kind of against distance fighting. And the other thing to note too is that the archers, it's not as though they're commoners or lesser people either. They're all noble, they're all highborn. Paris is an archer. Odysseus' archery skill is highlighted in the Odyssey. We have the trick of the bow that he's able to string and then able to aim the arrow through 12 axe heads that allows him to stump the suitors in the climax of that epic. So these are obviously great valorizations of the skill in archery. So I want to talk a bit about warrior ethos and generally as well. So as I've mentioned, Homer's heroes, that they can be distinguished in words and deeds, so politics and war. And Odysseus and Nestor are the primary examples, at least on the Greek side, of the former being of shining when it comes to words and politics. And obviously Achilles and Hector are the two champions that are most celebrated for their warrior deeds. And through excellence in war, the Homeric hero can expect to achieve honor and glory. Others will talk about his virtue and tell stories about him. But there's a duty to being this warrior as well, right? Again, in addition to this kind of selfish quest for seeking self-praise, there's this notion of the duty of the warrior. So because of their wealth, their power, and their status, as the elite of the community, they're obliged to protect the city from harm. So this is a famous vase showing a relief of images from the fall of Troy, the Mykonos base. So according to some scholarly interpretations of this relief, it was to remind the elite that a similar fate could await them if they fail to protect their city. So the murder of women and children, the rape of women, and them being sold into slavery. And there's a reference there to a good, as I said, interpretation that really draws that point home. So this is, again, a reminder of the duty of the warrior to protect the city, or else these types of atrocities, the atrocities that we know is in the background of this Troy story of the Iliad, will happen that could happen to your own city. So, for instance, in Book 12, Sarpedon describes to his comrade Glaucus. Remember, we talked about those heroes, allies of the Trojans from Lycia in southern what is today Turkey. So Sarpedon says, and this is the quote on the right, "Glaucus, why do they hold us both in honor, first by far with pride of place, choice meats and brimming cups in Lycia, where all our people look on us like gods? Why make us lords of estates along the Xanthus banks, rich in vineyards and plowland rolling wheat, so that now the duty's ours? We are the ones to head our Lycian front, brace and fling ourselves in the blaze of war." So again, the duty is to be at the front lines because of these privileges. You know, they give us these privileges because we do this. It's not for nothing. Okay, so we go to the front. We're the ones meeting the danger head on. We're not fighting at a distance. Brace and fling ourselves in the blaze of war. So a comrade strapped in combat gear may say, "Not without fame the men who rule in Lycia, these kings of ours who eat fat cuts of lamb and drink sweet wine, the finest stock we have, but they owe it all to their own fighting strength. Our great men of war, they lead our way in battle." So there was a sense, let us say, of so that's what we might call today social or income inequality, you know, that type of thing, which is a big public policy concern today, right? There's this sense of that inequality being earned or because of a certain duty, you know, like maybe the 0.1% of society would get a bit of a bit of a softer go of things if they paid their fair share, so to speak, in taxes. Is when, you know, they have their duty to pay back to the community, and that wealth that they've amassed or can be used at the front lines of battling poverty of children or other social ills. Hector voices this duty to fight for the community as well. So the Greeks are pinned to their ships, and Polydamas interprets an omen as a sign for them to retreat. And Hector dismisses this omen and insists on pressing on. He says, "Fight for your country. That is the best, the only omen." This is Book 12. And we'll also look at it in the next lecture, what's called his famous speech on the Warrior's Creed. So we'll look at that for sure in Book 6, another important articulation of this point. So that's kind of the warrior ethos, the duty of the warrior, according to the Homeric epic. And I also want to point out this notion of kind of the nobility and beauty, how they belong together in this sense. And this is very Greek. You don't see this really in other literatures, that's for sure. So in the Greek sense, excellence, so virtue, excellence, what makes a warrior great, let's say, and nobility, so arete is a word for excellence or virtue. They express themselves in beautiful physical form. So there is some sense of that in other cultures, that virtue expresses itself in its physical form. But this notion that virtue is tied to kind of a beautiful form is very, very, very Greek. So ancient Greek word for beautiful and noble are the same word, kalos. Okay, so the episode with Thersites in book 2 is an interesting example of where this is really borne out. So Thersites is referred to as the ugliest man who ever came to Troy, and he's petty, he's spiteful, and he spits venom on the leaders of the Trojan camp. He's despised by Odysseus because he's a commoner and a coward. So his social station, the way his virtue is expressed in action, it's not expressed in action that he's a coward, right? And it also expresses itself in his physical form. Let us say he's doesn't have this kind of physical, beautiful symmetry of form. He's ugly and deformed. And Odysseus famously beats him in book 2 because he's out of line, so to speak. So we have this kind of beautiful and noble Odysseus versus this let's say ugly and base / common Thersites in conflict within the Greek camp. And I'll just close here this in terms of this notion of warfare as such in the Iliad by reminding you of this theme of the limits of representation. Okay, so because of the scale, there's too many individuals. That's what we remember said. Both armies are very large, consisting of thousands and thousands of individuals. We wouldn't be able to follow the story of each individual. So the impacts on them, their families, what have you, would be too, the scale would be too much to try to encompass. And also this notion that the death of the soldier marks a limit point of experience that no one can describe. So there's this quote here from book 12. Now squad on squad, gate to gate they fought, but how can I tell it all, sing it all like a god? The strain is far too great. So the narrator expressing here in book 12 this sense that only a god could try to represent all of this. And this is part of the point of the invocation of the muse, is to inspire the poet to try to sing, to try to be able to represent beyond the limits of human, the human expression. But in book 12, there's this kind of sense of a sense of the impending failure of any attempt to try to represent those limits. So in this lecture, I'll close with that.